its growth, its healing, and its shadow. This recognition does not make you indifferent. On the contrary, it allows your compassion to become more precise. You can offer presence without overextension. You can support without self-erasure. You begin to understand that true empathy does not mean absorbing another's suffering. It means witnessing it with clarity and allowing the other person the dignity of their own process. Yet this stage also introduces a paradox that many empaths find difficult to articulate. As you become more inwardly stable, your external relationships often undergo significant shifts. Some connections deepen particularly. Ultimately those based on mutual self-awareness, but many others fade or dissolve entirely. This is not because you reject others, but because the unconscious dynamics that once held those relationships together can no longer function in the same way. You may notice that certain individuals withdraw from you without explanation. Others may attempt to provoke emotional reactions, testing whether you will return to your former role. Some may even accuse you of becoming cold or detached. Music. These reactions are not reflections of your true state. They are expressions of the discomfort that arises when familiar why others react, when you change psychological patterns are disrupted. It is crucial during this period that you do not interpret these responses as evidence that you have done something wrong. The emergence of Sophia inevitably disrupts unconscious relational systems. When you stop unconsciously stabilizing others' emotional worlds, they are forced to confront their own inner instability, and this confrontation often produces resistance internally. However, you begin to feel something that was previously rare in your experience, a quiet, enduring sense of sufficiency, not happy. SS in the conventional sense, but a deep recognition that you no longer need to justify your existence through emotional service. You begin to experience yourself as inherently valid, independent of your ability to maintain harmony around you. This shift often brings a subtle but powerful transformation in your physical experience as well. Many empaths report that chronic tension in the body begins to release. The jaw softens, the chest feels more open. Breathing becomes deeper and more natural. These changes reflect the nervous system's adaptation to a new mode of being, one no longer organized around constant vigilance and emotional scanning. You are no longer living in a state of perpetual anticipation. The hyper-awareness that once protected you is gradually replaced by a steadier form of consciousness, one that remains perceptive without being reactive. This is the psychological embodiment of Sophia awareness without entanglement, perception without absorption. And as this embodiment stabilizes, another remarkable realization begins to emerge. You start to see that much of your earlier life was shaped by unconscious loyalty to collective patterns, family dynamics, cultural experience, citations, relational roles passed down through generations. You recognize that your empathic identity was not purely individual but deeply interwoven with ancestral and systemic forces. In this recognition lies another layer of awakening. You begin to understand that your individuation process is not only personal, it is transgenerational. By withdrawing from unconscious patterns of emotional absorption, you are interrupting cycles that may have existed long before you were born. You are reclaiming psychic autonomy not only for yourself, but as part of a larger movement within the collective unconscious. This realization often brings a sense of solemn responsibility, but also profound meaning. Your life begins to feel less like a series of isolated experiences and more like the loneliness of vertical awareness, coherent journey toward integration. Even past suffering begins to appear in a new light, not as meaningless pain, music, but as material that forged the depth of awareness you now inhabit. And yet, despite this growing clarity, the Sophia phase is not without its challenges. There are moments when the quiet becomes almost too vast, when the loss of familiar relational role. It feels disorienting. You may wonder whether you have become too distant from ordinary human connection. You may feel the tension between your expanded awareness and the everyday world that still operates within unconscious patterns. It is here that the final lesson of this stage, music, begins to unfold. A lesson that cannot be learned intellectually, but only lived. It is the understanding that true belonging does not come from dissolving into others, nor from isolating yourself entirely. It emerges from standing fully within your own center, while remaining open to authentic connection. Sophia does not ask you to withdraw from humanity. She asks you to engage with it from a place of wholeness rather than fragmentation. She teaches that the deepest form of empathy is not emotional absorption but conscious presence. It is the ability to stand with another person in truth without losing yourself or attempting to control their process. And as you continue to embody this presence, you will begin to notice something subtle yet profound. The world around you starts to respond differently. Interactions become fewer but more meaningful. Conversations carry greater depth. Relationships that remain in your life are those capable of meeting you in awareness rather than unconscious exchange. This is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new phase one in which your empathic nature is no longer a source of exhaustion, but a refined instrument of perception, guided by an inner authority that cannot be shaken by external turbulence. And from this place, snorts, another transformation begins to take shape within you, one that moves beyond clarity into something even more mysterious. The emergence of an inner stillness so deep that it begins to alter your relationship not only with others but with life itself. And when this deeper stillness begins to settle within you, you may notice something that at first feels almost impossible to describe because it does not resemble any previous state you have known. It is not peace in the ordinary sense, for ordinary peace still depends upon circumstances. The shift from relational identity to essential self, it is not emotional calm alone, because emotional calm can still be disturbed by external forces. What emerges now is something far more fundamental, a quiet center of gravity within the psyche that remains steady even when the outer world shifts. You begin to feel that you are no longer living primarily on the surface of experience. Before, your consciousness moved horizontally, reacting to events, responding to people, adjusting to emotional currents as they arose. But now your awareness moves vertically. You experience a sense of depth beneath every moment, as though each interaction is only the visible layer of a much larger psychological reality. This vertical awareness changes the way you encounter life. Situations that once appeared chaotic now reveal their symbolic structure. You begin to perceive patterns unfolding across time, recurring themes in relationships, repeated emotional configurations, cycles of projection and withdrawal. It becomes clear to you that much of what people call random is, in fact, the manifestation of unconscious dynamics seeking expression. This perception does not lead you to judge others. On the contrary, it often evokes a deep compassion that is different from the empathy you once practiced before. Your compassion required you to feel what others felt to enter their emotional world almost completely. Now compassion arises from understanding the forces shaping the AR behavior, the fears, wounds, and unresolved conflicts operating beneath their awareness. You see how often people are not acting freely but reacting to invisible pressures within themselves. You recognize that many conflicts are not truly between individuals, but between unintegrated parts of the psyche seeking recognition. And with this recognition comes a profound release from the compulsion to intervene. This release introduces a new experience that may initially feel unsettling. You begin to trust the process of life itself, where once you felt responsible for maintaining harmony, you now sense that each person must encounter their own shadow in their own time. You understand that growth cannot be imposed from outside. It must arise from within the individual, often through confrontation with discomfort or crisis. This trust does not make you passive. Rather, it allows you to act with greater precision. You intervene only when intervention aligns with the deeper movement of the situation, not when it merely relieves temporary tension. You begin to speak less. But when silence becomes nourishing when you do speak, your words carry a clarity that others can feel even if they do not fully understand it. It is here that many empaths notice another remarkable transformation. Their relationship to truth changes. Before, you often softened truth to preserve harmony. You sensed what others needed to hear, and you adjusted your expression accordingly. But as Sophia continues to unfold within you, truth becomes inseparable from integrity. You find that you can no longer distort your perception to maintain comfort. This does not mean you become harsh or confrontational. On the contrary, your expression often becomes quieter, more measured. Yet, there is a new firmness within it, a refusal to participate in illusions. You begin to embody what might be called a silent authority, not an authority imposed upon others, but one that arises from alignment with your own inner reality. Others often perceive this change before you fully recognize it yourself. They may describe you as grounded, centered, or even intimidating, though you may feel simply calm. This reaction occurs because your presence no longer adapts unconsciously to the emotional expectations of the environment. Instead, you remain anchored in your own center, and this stability alters the dynamics of interaction. Tone around you. Some people are drawn to this presence, sensing its authenticity. Others feel unsettled by it because it disrupts their habitual patterns of projection. They can no longer unconsciously assign you the role of emotional stabilizer or silent absorber. They encounter instead a person who reflects reality back to them without distortion. This reflective quality is one of the most subtle yet powerful aspects of the Sophia phase. Without attempting to do so, you become a mirror in which others can see themselves more clearly. Not because you analyze or confront them, but because your clarity removes the distortions that once allowed their unconscious patterns to remain hidden. At times, this mirroring can provoke resistance. People may react with irritation or withdrawal, sensing that they cannot engage with you in the same unconscious ways as before. Yet others may experience a different response. They may feel strangely relieved, as though they can finally encounter a presence that does not require performance or emotional manipulation. Internally, you experience a growing sense of the dissolution of guilt and emotional obligation alignment between your inner and outer woe, RLDs. The tension that once existed between what you felt and what you expressed begins to dissolve. You no longer suppress your perceptions to maintain external equilibrium. Instead, your actions arise more naturally from your authentic awareness. This alignment brings with it an unexpected form of vitality. You may notice an increase in creative impulses, an urge to write, to create, to explore ideas that previously remained dormant. This creative awakening is not accidental. Music, it reflects the liberation of psychic energy that was once bound to maintaining relational stability. The unconscious, no longer occupied with constant emotional regulation, begins to express itself through symbolic and creative channels. You may find yourself drawn to art, philosophy, spirituality, or other forms of inquiry that explore the deeper dimensions of existence. These interests are not escapes from reality. They are expressions of your psyche's movement toward wholeness. Dreams during this period often become more luminous. You may encounter figures of guidance, wise women, teachers, or symbolic animals that represent instinctual knowledge. These images signify that your relationship with the unconscious, has shifted from conflict to collaboration. Music, you are no longer defending against its contents. You are learning to listen to its language, and yet alongside this expansion, there remains a profound challenge. The Sophia phase requires you to relinquish the illusion that you can be fully understood by those who have not undergone a similar transformation. You may come to accept that your inner experience cannot always be translated into ordinary language. There will be aspects of your perception that remain invisible to others. This realization can evoke a sense of existential solitude, not loneliness in the sense of lacking companionship, but a deeper recognition that individuation ultimately leads each person into a unique inner territory. You understand that no one can fully walk this path for you, just as you cannot walk it for another. Yet within this solitude lies a paradoxical connection to something larger than individual identity. As you deepen into your own center, you may begin to feel a subtle sense of unity with life itself. You perceive that beneath the diversity of human experiences lies a shared psychological foundation, a collective unconscious. In shadow integration and inner authority which all psyches are rooted, this perception transforms your understanding of empathy. Once again, you no longer experience empathy only as sensitivity to individual emotions. You begin to feel an attunement to the broader currents of the human condition, the universal struggles, archetypal patterns, and existential questions that shape all lives. From this perspective, your personal journey appears not as an isolated story, but as one expression of a collective process. The Sophia awakening within you reflects a movement occurring in the larger field of consciousness, a gradual shift from unconscious adaptation toward conscious integration. This awareness often brings a profound humility. You recognize that your clarity is not a personal achievement alone, but the result of forces far greater than individual, forces that have shaped the evolution of human consciousness across generations. And as this humility settles within you, another subtle transformation begins to unfold. The need to define yourself through identity labels on rows or even psychological categories starts to diminish. You experience yourself less as a fixed personality, and more as a dynamic process, an unfolding relationship between conscious awareness and unconscious depth. This shift alters your relationship to the future. Music. You no longer feel compelled to control outcomes or predict emotional trajectories. Instead, you develop a quiet confidence in your ability to meet whatever arises. This confidence is not based on certainty, but on trust in your capacity for awareness. And from this place of trust, something even more profound begins to emerge, a sense that your life is no longer organized around survival or adaptation, but around meaning itself. You begin to perceive that every experience, even difficulty, carries symbolic significance. Life is no longer merely something that happens to you. It becomes something that speaks to you. It is at this stage that the deepest dimension of the Sophia awakening begins to reveal itself, not simply as psychological clarity, but as a transformation in your relationship with existence. You start to sense that beneath the visible world lies an underlying order, a subtle intelligence guiding the unfolding of events. And as you continue to inhabit this awareness, another question begins to arise within you. Oh, one that marks the threshold of the final movement in this process. If you are no longer defined by the roles you once inhabited, and no longer driven by the emergence of psychological sovereignty adaptation, then who in the deepest sense are you becoming now? And when this question finally rises within you, not as an abstract thought, but as a quiet, persistent presence, you may notice that it does not demand an immediate answer. It does not carry the urgency that once accompanied questions of identity. Instead, it settles into you like a deep echo, inviting not analysis, but encounter. For in the Sophia phase, the question of who you are is no longer something to be solved intellectually. It becomes something to be lived, something revealed slowly through the alignment of your inner and outer worlds. You begin to sense that the self you once believed yourself to be was never a fixed entity, but a constellation of adaptations shaped by necessity. The empathic roles you inhabited were real, but they were not the totality of your being. They were layers, protective structures formed in response to environments that required sensitivity, vigilance, and emotional attunement, and for survival. As these layers loosen, what remains is not emptiness as many fear, but a more essential presence. A self that does not rely on constant relational feedback to know it exists. You experience this presence most clearly in moments of quiet awareness, when you are neither reacting to the past nor anticipating the future. In these moments, you sense a continuity beneath all experiences, a stable center that has accompanied you throughout your life, even when you were not conscious of it. This center is what the language of depth psychology would call the self, not the ego, which organizes daily functioning, but the deeper organizing principle of the psyche. The self is not an identity you construct. It is an inner reality you gradually discover. It represents the totality of your being, encompassing both conscious awareness and unconscious depth. When the empath reaches the Sophia phase, the relationship between ego and self begins to shift. The ego no longer attempts to control or manage the psyche through constant adaptation. Instead, it learns to listen. You begin to feel guided by an inner orientation that does not originate from social expectations or emotional pressure. Yours, but from a deeper alignment within. From emotional absorption to conscious presence, this alignment manifests in subtle yet unmistakable ways. Decisions arise with a sense of clarity that feels almost quiet in its certainty. You may find yourself choosing paths that do not immediately make sense to others, yet they carry a resonance within you that feels undeniable. It is as though your life is no longer directed solely by conscious intention, but by an underlying current that gently shapes your movement through the world. At this stage, you also begin to recognize something profound about suffering itself. You see that much of your earlier pain arose not only from external circumstances, but from the fragmentation of your own psyche, the conflict between who you truly were and the roles you felt compelled to maintain. The exhaustion of the empath was never simply the result of giving too much. It was the result of living divided, one part of you constantly attending to others while another part remained unseen and unexpressed. Sophia represents the integration of this division. She does not eliminate your empathic nature. She transforms it. Your sensitivity remains, but it is no longer organized around self-sacrifice. It becomes an instrument of perception guided by the self rather than by unconscious compulsion. And as this integration deepens, your relationship with others undergoes its final transformation. You no longer approach relationships as fields to be stabilized or problems to be solved. Instead, you encounter others as separate centers of consciousness, each engaged in their own journey of individuation. This recognition allows for a new form of connection, one based not on emotional fusion, but on mutual presence. You begin to experience relationships as meetings between two autonomous psyches rather than as systems of dependency. There is less urgency to fix, to explain, or to maintain constant harmony. The final realization: who are you becoming? Instead, there is a quiet respect for the autonomy of each person's inner process. In such relationships, silence no longer feels threatening. It becomes a space of shared being rather than an absence to be filled. Conversations deepen not because they are more frequent, but because they arise from authenticity rather than unconscious expectation. You discover that true intimacy does not require constant emotional exchange. It requires the courage to be fully present without losing yourself. At the same time, you accept that not all relationships can evolve in this way. Some connections will remain rooted in earlier dynamics, unable to adapt to your new orientation. And part of the Sophia phase is the ability to release these connections without bitterness. You understand that each psyche moves according to its own timing, music, and that separation does not signify failure but differentiation internally. Another remarkable shift occurs. Your relationship with uncertainty transforms. Where once ambiguity produced anxiety, you now experience it as openness. You no longer require life to be predictable in order to feel secure. Instead, you trust your capacity to remain centered amid change. This trust arises from the recognition that the true foundation of stability lies not in external conditions, but in the relationship between your ego and the self. As long as this relationship remains intact, you can navigate complexity without losing your inner coherence. You may also begin to notice a subtle change in your perception of meaning. Life events no longer appear as isolated incidents. They reveal themselves as part of a larger symbolic narrative unfolding through your existence. Moments of difficulty, loss, or transition are no longer experienced solely as disruptions. They become thresholds, invitations to further integration. Living from the center of the self in this sense, snorts, the Sophia awakening alters your experience of time itself. The past is no longer a burden you carry unconsciously. It becomes a source of insight, its patterns understood and integrated. The future is no longer a source of anxiety to be controlled. It becomes an open field of possibility shaped by your ongoing alignment with the self. And perhaps most significantly, you begin to experience a quiet reconciliation with yourself. The internal conflicts that once defined your psychological life gradually resolve. You no longer feel compelled to choose between sensitivity and strength, between connection and autonomy, between compassion and clarity. These opposites begin to coexist within you as complementary aspects of a unified whole. This unity does not eliminate complexity. You still encounter challenges, uncertainties, and emotional fluctuations, but beneath these emotions lies a stable ground, a deep sense of inner coherence that cannot be easily disrupted. It is from this ground that the final gift of the Sophia phase emerges, a quiet form of wisdom that expresses itself not through grand declarations, but through presence itself. Your way of being becomes your most powerful influence. You no longer need to persuade or convince. Your clarity communicates without effort. Others may come to you seeking guidance, sensing that you embody a perspective they cannot yet articulate. And in such moments, you do not offer solutions in the traditional sense. Instead, you offer presence, a presence that allows others to encounter themselves more honestly. For this is the ultimate transformation of the empath who reaches Sophia. You cease to carry others' emotions, and instead you create a space in which they can carry their own. You do not rescue. You do not absorb. You do not stabilize unconsciously. You witness. You reflect. You remain. And in remaining fully present within yourself, you become something rare in the human world, a person who is both deeply connected and profoundly autonomous, both sensitive and unwavering, both compassionate and clear. His is why the Sophia awakening is so uncommon. It requires the courage to relinquish identities that once defined you. Music. It demands the willingness to endure periods of solitude and misunderstanding. Music. It asks you to confront not only the shadows of others but your own, yet in return it offers something beyond any role or adaptation. The experience of living from the center of your own being aligned with a deeper order that transcends both personal history and external expectation. And when you reach this point, you realize that the journey was never about becoming someone new. It was about uncovering what was always present beneath the layers of adaptation. The quiet, enduring self that has been guiding you from the beginning, waiting patiently for the moment when you would finally be ready to recognize it as your own deepest truth.